back on the Zero Hour. I am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. The object that I am holding in my hand, if you're watching on television, and if you're not, why not? The object that I'm holding in my hand is the new book by my next guest. She's been on the program many times before, but not with a hit book rocketing up the bestseller list as this is literally doing. The Deficit Myth is the name of the book. The subtitle, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. My guest is the author, economist Stephanie Kelton. And Stephanie, first of all, congratulations on the book's publication and on it doing so well.
Thank you very much. It's been a heck of a week. Really, really fun.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear it. And you've been doing, from what I understand, interviews back to back, which gets me, I guess, to my first question, which is the book has gotten a great deal of attention since it's come out, and your work has gotten a great deal of attention in recent months. When you and I first met some years ago, Modern Monetary Theory, which we could talk about what it is, but it was a little known, I would say, aspect of economic thought, and it has increasingly acquired a visibility and attention, sometimes flattering, sometimes not. But why do you think it is that there's such an upsurge in, first of all, I guess, a brief description of what modern monetary theory is, and perhaps why you think there's been an upsurge of interest in it right now?
Sure. Well, so let's do what is MMT and the quick and dirty kind of sketch that I can give on a moment like this. So look, MMT is a school of thought in macroeconomics. Okay, so it's a framework. And this framework asks us to begin with a recognition that the monetary system that we have today is one where the government is the issuer of a fiat currency. It is not convertible into gold or anything else at a fixed price. The government doesn't tell you, if you bring me $10 bills, I will give you some little bit of gold or something like that. It's a floating fiat currency. And it's been that way since Richard Nixon took the US off of what was effectively a gold standard in 1971. So we have this different monetary system now, and we still, in very many ways, have a political discourse, policy debates that are wrapped around a belief that somehow we are still on a gold standard. You hear people talk about, how are you going to pay for that? Where will you find the money? What does that mean? Find the money, like it's an Easter egg hunt, or like you literally have to go mine gold in order to fund government spending. So we're asking people to recognize that many of the things we've been taught to think about, the way where the government gets money, how it spends, the role of taxes, deficits, and debt, so much of what we've been told is either wrong or inapplicable or both. And so MMT tries to set the record straight, paint a clearer picture of how the economy works, how the monetary system works, and point to the fact that that opens up a lot of policy space. There are things the government can do with the federal budgeting process to make fuller use of the monetary system, to solve real problems in our economy, but that it doesn't do so for fear of adding to the deficit or increasing the national debt. So that's a really quick and dirty.
Of course. And so the deficit myth is the title of the book. So the myth you're describing is the myth that if the government, meaning the federal government, the currency issuing government, might spend all of the gold coins it has in the bank, and then it has to find a leprechaun and follow him to the end of the rainbow, or to get more gold coins. That's the myth. And modern monetary theory, I guess then my next question, then we'll get to the upsurge in interest. When I think of a theory, I think of it as a mental frameworks we build, whether it's in science or anything else, to help us interpret how the world works. We build the framework in our minds, and then we test it against reality. Now, I would argue or it could be argued that modern monetary theory has been tested, in fact, over and over again in the last decade against reality. So, first part of the question, do you agree with that? Second part, if you do, how's it done?
Yeah, I definitely agree with it. For example, you heard a lot of hand wringing about deficits after the financial crisis in 2008, when President Obama was elected the first time, and he takes office and the wheels are coming off the economy and the deficit is exploding. Congress passes stimulus bill to try to deal with the economic fallout. That adds also to the deficit, but mostly just the rotten economy is driving the deficit higher. And people are saying, this is terrible. This is unsustainable. We got to do something. And, President Obama himself called for a commission to wrestle the deficit back down. It was, the Simpson-Bowles commission and so forth. We got to get this thing under control or really bad things will happen, right? All of these things. And so, roll the clock forward, and we're told that the accumulated debt that resulted from all of that deficit spending was going to leave us in worse shape fiscally, that it was adding to our country's fiscal woes, and that Congress was going to have to act to rein in the debt and bring deficits down. We wouldn't be able to afford things. What happens? The Republicans come in. They massively cut taxes at the end of 2017. They passed the so-called Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That adds another couple of trillion to deficits. You hear all kinds of hand-wringing. Oh, it's the end of the world. Interest rates are going to spike. We'll never be able to spend again. Former Treasury secretaries warning that the U.S. would be living on a shoestring for decades to come, that we would not have the fiscal power to respond to the next downturn because we had just added to the deficit. And boy, our hands are tied now. We won't be able to do anything. Fast forward. Where are we? Coronavirus. What does Congress do? Kick legislation through the House and the Senate. Trillions of dollars are moving, and the deficit is increased again. So is MMT being tested? Yes, because we said all along, from well before the financial crisis in 2008, that deficits aren't inherently dangerous, that the way we think about them is mostly wrong, that they aren't unsustainable, that the real limit is inflation, not insolvency. That brings me to the next point, which is Europe, which we also got correct when many people didn't really see any problem with all of these countries in Europe giving up their sovereign currencies, a currency like the drachma that Greece and the Greek government used to be able to issue. All of these countries gave up their sovereign currencies. And a lot of economists said, so what? What difference does it make, right? You don't really need fiscal policy anyway. You just need a central bank with credibility, and the central bank will steer the economy. And this doesn't pose any problems. In fact, it increases efficiencies because now these countries can all trade with the same currency. It was MMT economists who, before the ink was even dry on the Maastricht Treaty, which is the blueprint for the euro, we were saying this is not going to go well because if countries give up their sovereign currencies, they're going to turn themselves into currency users, much like individual states in the US. So I could go on, Richard, for a very long time with a track record of, and I think it answers your earlier question about why people finally started paying attention. And I think honestly that the answer has largely is about the fact that we have accumulated over a period of decades now a damn good track record. We have gotten the big stuff right, and I can't think of a single thing. This is, not to sound braggadocious, as they say, but I don't think we've gotten anything wrong. We certainly haven't made any major calls incorrectly. And I think we've gotten all the big stuff right. And if we'd gotten it wrong, believe me, our critics would be screaming it from the rooftops. But there's just nothing they can point to, I think, that we haven't got the analytics correct.
And again, we're talking with the economist Stephanie Kelton, whose new book is The Deficit Myth. And so again, it seems like I may be over parsing the title, but I think it's important. Modern monetary theory and the birth of the people's economy. The Europe example seems to be one dimension of that phrase, people's economy. To me, it means that what the European countries did by sacrificing their own currencies and subordinating to a collective currency was they lost an important dimension of their democracy or their democratic autonomy, as we saw in the case of Greece, for example. There's an interlinking between the issuance of currency and a people's ability to govern themselves. At least that's the way I read it. Is that right? And is that part of the thinking of the people's economy choice of words?
Yeah, absolutely. There once was public money and now there isn't. And the inability of a government to exercise the power of the purse, if you like, to solve problems when the economic conditions are changing and your economy is deteriorating, and you can't simply step up and act on behalf of the people of your country to protect, to support incomes, to defend and protect jobs and protect your economy, because you have to go ask somebody else, may I do this? May I have permission to do this? Can I have the money to fund these programs? You definitely place yourself in a subservient position vis-a-vis your own currency and your ability to care for your people. So, you look around today in the US and you look at these governors. You got governors from one coast to the other, Cuomo in New York, Gavin Newsom in California. They're all begging the federal government for aid because state governors, can't issue the currency. If they could, they'd handle the problem themselves. There's a reason that they're imploring Congress to get them the aid that they need. It's because, like these European countries, they can't act on their own to deal with the problem. So, yes, you're correct.
Okay, and I'm glad to hear it. And Stephanie Kelton, there's another dimension of this people's economy phrase too, which is, and perhaps this has something to do with both the enthusiasm the idea has generated and the opposition that is generated too, which is as long as, even within the United States, as long as people believe that there are external rules regarding deficit spending and that to violate those rules is to create disaster, then also even within a country like the United States, in my view, that means giving up some of your democratic autonomy to the experts, the ones who have the secret knowledge of how such things work, of at what the levels at which you can spend or not spend, borrow or not borrow, why it's bad, what kind of government spending is acceptable, not acceptable, so that in effect, a theory that says, no, that isn't the issue, those aren't the limitations, and we can get to what the limitations are, but as soon as you say, no, those technical beliefs are not the limitations, you have more authority for the democratic process, but less for a certain select group of people who have expertise based on the former beliefs about the deficit. I think you get what I'm driving at.
Who are treated as people with expertise.
Okay.
Yes. I think that's exactly right. They are gatekeepers and defenders of a certain status quo. And I do hope that one of the things that this book accomplishes is that it is empowering to ordinary people who don't know the secrets of the temple and who, we're bombarded every single day with these myths. And, while the book is called The Deficit Myth, there unfortunately isn't just one deficit myth. There is a web of entangled myths that feed on one another. And the first 6 chapters of the book each take up a different myth. So there are lots of them. And, people just don't know better. And you're right that there are so-called experts who espouse very technical, very often empirical. They sound compelling, right? They'll put a model out there. They show you charts and graphs and numbers and tell stories about the risks and dangers associated with deficits. And then our politicians can, in fact, empathize with voters. If voters are frustrated that people don't have adequate health care, that our educational system is becoming so unaffordable that people can't, send their kids to college, that our infrastructure is crumbling, and your congressman or congresswoman comes back to the district and gets up at a town hall and faces his or her constituents, and the constituents are railing, why aren't you doing more for our district? Why aren't you bringing this? Say, oh, I would love, believe me, I wish I could, right? I'd like to bring back more, but we got this deficit, we got this $23 trillion debt. And then everybody goes, oh, that's right, we can't do, and you go back into docile mode because you think that those are the real limits that constrain our ability to do things. So it provides a certain protective cover for a lot of people.
For certain choices, yeah. And it's always been striking how Republicans, when they're out of power, say we can't afford it. And when they're in power, say $2 trillion here for a tax break, $6 trillion here for potential bailouts, businesses. Fine. Their monetary thinking anyway seems to flip. And Stephanie Kelton, I guess the other, and I really want to talk about this with you because I think it's a misconception, but the other thing I hear a lot about modern monetary theory is, well, they literally think money grows on trees. There are no limits. It's a magical universe where you can do anything you want all the time. And I just, that, first of all, that violates the way the human brain works. We don't believe in magical everything all the time. But secondly, my limited understanding is that that's not the way modern monetary theory works, that there are limits. They're just not what we've been told they are. And if that's right, maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Exactly. So the limits aren't the ones that we've been taught to adhere to. So the first chapter of the book is called Don't Think of a Household. And that's what we've been talking about. The federal government doesn't have to operate its budget like you and I do because it's the issuer of the currency and you and I are just currency users. So they get to play by a different set of rules. Now, does that mean that there are no limits? That because the government can issue the currency, they can issue it willy-nilly, spendthrift, no regard, deficits don't matter, just have it all, spend? The answer is no. The second chapter of the book is titled Think of Inflation. So right away, I get to the heart of the limits. The constraint is in our real economy. So Richard, all government spending today and yesterday and last year and the decade before that, all government spending is carried out by Congress passing legislation, authorizing a budget, instructing its bank, the Federal Reserve, to carry out the payments on behalf of the US Treasury. How does the Fed carry out the payments? They use a keyboard at the Federal Reserve Bank, and they change the numbers in the appropriate bank accounts. If Congress says we're going to do a big defense contract with Lockheed Martin, then type, Lockheed Martin's balance increases. Okay, so all government spending gives birth to new dollars. So a dollar is born. Now that dollar can travel around the economy. Okay, so the government hires some workers to do infrastructure or builds a hospital or whatever the case is. Somebody gets paid. And now with that income, somebody can pay their rent. They can go have a meal. They can go to a movie. I mean, in normal times when we're doing all that right. kind of stuff, right? So now the restaurant owner has a dollar and they pay the busboy. Now the busboy has a dollar and he pays his rent. And now the landlord has a dollar and he goes to a movie. And you see how this dollar is changing hands and helping to support jobs in our economy. The dollar dies when we send it back to the government. So when you write that check out to the IRS, usually on April 15th or thereabouts, you're sending those dollars to the graveyard. So what I'm saying is there is a natural way that the amount of dollars is regulated. They get spent into existence and then they get taken out, they die when the government taxes them back. So what is the limit? The limit is how much can the economy handle in terms of total spending? If the restaurant is full up and there's a line of people that have to wait an hour for a booth and you can't buy a ticket to the movie theater because all the seats are sold and you can't get a hotel room because the place is booked up, and you see what I'm saying, right? You can't, that's full employment. And once you reach full employment, any additional spending, not just government spending, but any additional spending carries it will bring inflationary pressures, right? So the relevant constraint is inflation. It's our economy's real resource capacity. When we're looking around at our economy today, we got tens of millions of people who've lost their jobs. We have businesses that are losing customers because people are staying home, right? More spending less. We have a lot of slack in the economy, and that creates space for some spending to take place without creating inflationary pressure. So the limits are in the real economy. As long as the real economy can meet higher spending with higher supply, with higher production, you're safe. The limits come in when you run out of resource capacity. You get to full employment.
So let me ask, and again, we're talking with Stephanie Kelton, author of the new book, The Deficit Myth. So let me ask another question, a more prescribed or limited and, absurdly simplistic question about inflation. But let's say that the government, Congress passes a law that says that it is going to buy a bouquet of flowers for every adult in America. That's okay. Let's say that's 300 million plus a vase. That's 300 million Americans. Let's say it's $70 a bouquet. So that's what? Now we're talking about several trillion, 7 trillion. I'm not sure. I can't do the math in my head and broadcast the show at the same time. But it's trillions of dollars, I guess, when you're done, and certainly billions. And so that's okay from a modern monetary theory point of view. The spending is fine, but there are only so many flowers in North America. So at some point, there are going to be so few flowers left for everybody else that a bouquet of flowers is going to cost $1,000 because it's an utter rarity. They've all been harvested and given away. Is that another example of a real world limitation to government spending, or does it just not make sense?
Well, I give you credit for thinking of something that's both beautiful and very outside the box. Look, I
take that as a no, it doesn't make sense answer.
It doesn't make sense to make a pledge to deliver a real thing to the people of this country if you don't have the material resources to make good on that promise. But having said that, if the government committed to this flower delivery program, which I quite like, it could begin hiring people, and a lot of people whose jobs would be to grow flowers, right? So I guess the question is, do you have some idle labor kicking around, and do you have some fertile, I don't know, ground, whatever you need to grow a bunch of roses or tulips or whatever? But that's the limit, right? That would be the hitch. Is that the right way to say it? The hitch in the program, carrying it out successfully, would be whether you can deliver the real goods, right?
And so therefore, to me, it seems that smart policy making from an MMT point of view would be, before you roll out your flower program, instead of saying, well, we don't have the money for it, I'm going to hate myself afterwards that I didn't do it in my head, because normally I could do it in my head, but whatever it is, that we don't have the money for it, which is the way it would work today. A smart economic policy process under MMT would say, let's figure out the current flower producing capability. Do we have the ability to do it? Do we have the resources to make ourselves able to do it before we decide? And what would the impact be on the whole flower economy and the economy as a whole? And you would do all that before you made the decision to do it or not do it, but you would not do it based on an artificial belief or constraint around deficits. You would do it around resources, current and potential in the future. And if you can do it, then you do it. If you can't, then you adjust the plans accordingly. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, Richard. Let's do it with infrastructure and healthcare, just quickly, because I think that would make sense. We have, the American Society of Civil Engineers comes out with a report card every couple of years, and they give us the grade for America's infrastructure, everything from wastewater treatment and airports and hospitals and bridges and roads and dams and all that stuff, right? And they grade our infrastructure, and we got a D+ grade that I think we're sitting on at the moment. And the estimate from the civil engineers is that we need to spend more than $4.5 trillion to bring America's infrastructure up to a passing grade, right? Up to snuff. So suppose Congress got serious and said, let's deal with infrastructure. Let's get an A grade. Let's fix everything that needs fixing. Let's do it. So they commit $4.5 trillion or whatever to doing infrastructure, but nobody pauses to think, do we have construction workers, architects, engineers, steel? Do we have the heavy machines? Like, is all that stuff going to be available to be hired so we can roll this infrastructure investment out and get going? If it's not, you're going to be competing for all of that stuff with the private sector if it's already being used, and then you're going to create inflation in those products in that industry. Now, do healthcare. If you're going to do Medicare for all, along the lines that Senator Sanders proposed, where you don't just give everyone the existing Medicare program, but you beef up Medicare, make it more generous so that people get long-term care, they get vision, they get dental, they get medical health, right? And everybody gets it. So the question is, do you have the mental health care professionals? Do you have enough doctors, nurses, hospital beds? Do you have, right? Can you deliver in real terms what it is that you're promising? Because it turns out the money is the easiest part. And that's what we end up arguing about, the pay for. Where will the money come from? That turns out that's the least important question, because it's the easiest to handle. Question is real resources.
And then I guess the end point, if I'm understanding correctly, Stephanie Kelton, from an MMT point of view, would be, once you've enacted some of the programs you talk about in the book as potential, I mean, as you say, it could be used for conservative goals and has been, as well as progressive ones. But let's say, we have Medicare for all, we have a jobs guarantee program, we have other progressive programs in place. Then the question becomes, if the effect of all that is starting to be inflationary, but society is determined, let's say, that everyone does have a right to a job, everyone does have a right to medical care, then taxation, rather than thinking of it as that's where the dollars will come from to pay for all this stuff, becomes more a matter of managing the balance of the economy when inflation starts to loom. Is that correct too?
Yeah, if the impetus, if the thing that's driving the inflationary pressure is too much spending in the aggregate, right? That the whole economy is trying to spend too much, and producers can't keep up in terms of supply. So inflation begins to increase. Then one way, but definitely not the only way, to mitigate the inflationary pressure is to send more dollars to the graveyard, right? To get them out of people's hands so that they can't chase goods and services in the economy. So that would be one way to do it. But the thing is, a couple of things. One is that the best way to guard against an inflation problem is preemptively. It is with a good offense, not to chase it defensively after inflation gets out of hand. So that's why I talk so much in the book about, changing the way we approach the federal budgeting process so that Congress has to stop and ask, do we run the risk of creating inflationary pressures with this spending proposal before they do it? Not after they vote for it and the spending happens, but before they authorize the spending. And what frustrates me is, having worked in the Senate, I never heard a single staffer, not one, I never heard a single member of the Senate on either side of the aisle use the I word, inflation. It's not even an afterthought. They just don't think about it at all. And what I'm saying is that if you're going to write a $4 trillion infrastructure bill, think about the inflationary potential associated with that spending before you vote for it. Analyze, right? Do the macro analytics so that you figure out, would it be safe to do this over a 10-year period? Could we do it over 5? How much can we roll out? How quickly? And then think about the offsets. Like, do I need to raise taxes to put some dollars into this part of the economy? Do I need to remove some dollars somewhere in order to prevent my spending from creating inflation? So that's how I think about it.
And this is where I think the criticisms that I've seen of MMT from the left, which seem to be fewer than from the right, at least in my experience, but they take that kind of thinking, and the critiques I've seen say, well, MMT says you should make life more expensive for working people when things get tight, as opposed to what I hear you saying is, this is kind of a mechanism that needs to be kept in balance, but you're not advocating doing it one way versus another. So if you do a hypothetical example, I mean, John Maynard Keynes in his book, How to Pay for the Wear, talked about holding back, as I recall, income for workers while the war was going on. But whatever mechanism you use, I think you're saying that modern monetary theory is neutral about all of that. That debate happens when you decide how you want to put this theory into practice, which would make those left critiques kind of, they're ascribing views to it that it doesn't possess because it's a theory. Do you know what I'm trying to say? And is that making sense?
I do. I mean, I think I'm familiar with probably some of the people and some of the critiques. Let me try to address it this way. If we're in a depressed economy the way we are today, and Congress doesn't want to listen to MMT, they want to be so-called fiscally responsible. They want to do infrastructure, but they want to pay for it because they're afraid to add to the deficit. Now, you could do that. You could write a $2 trillion or $4 trillion piece of legislation and say, we're going to spend this trillions of dollars on infrastructure. But we don't trust MMT. So we aren't going to add to the deficit. We're going to make sure that it's deficit neutral. It's all paid for. We're going to raise taxes. Okay, on whom? So now you have to pick two fights, right? You have to pick two fights. You got to go convince enough of your colleagues to vote for the spending that you want to do, but you also have to convince them to vote for the tax increase to keep it from adding to the deficit. Now, maybe you can accomplish that. I didn't see it happen in my time in the Senate, but maybe you can persuade enough Democrats and Republicans to vote for tax increases that you could actually make this work. Now, on whom? Democrats would raise taxes on people that make a lot of money, right? They would try to limit the pain of a tax increase to the people who can best afford to bear that cost, right? I have no problem with that. I just don't believe taxes finance government spending. But okay, let's say we do trillions of dollars of infrastructure, we raise taxes on the rich. So what happens? Lots of people who work in construction, right, get jobs and they start working and their income increases and they get paid to build a bridge and fix a road. So society gets a new bridge and those folks get paid to build that bridge. But some rich folks have their bank accounts debited. So they don't have some dollars now, but workers over here have those dollars and now society has a bridge. Okay. You might be able to pass that legislation, but MMT says that very often you can accomplish the goal, which is to fix infrastructure, by just picking one fight. And picking one fight means I just have to go collect votes to pass an infrastructure bill. And now I hire a bunch of construction workers and architects and we pay them so they get income and society gets a bridge. So now you have a bridge and you have some more dollars in the economy. Under the other system, you have a bridge and no more dollars. You just reallocated from some balance sheets to other balance sheets. So, this idea that MMT wants to put the pain on the little guy, no, of course not. You don't have to raise anybody's taxes unless you're trying to mitigate inflationary pressure, but you can raise taxes on the rich, not because you need their money, but because you want to start tackling income and wealth inequality, and you want to make the income tax system more progressive. You want to do something to address concentrations of wealth. You don't even need the excuse of spending in order to properly advocate for realigning the tax code for the sake of, democracy, right?
Right. No, I absolutely understand. And by the way, these conversations never talk about the invisible taxes of, the $3,500 deductible on your health plan, private sector health plan, or what have you. But we're running out of time, Stephanie Kelton. So I guess before I let you go, what is one thing you think people should know about this book, or why should they buy it, or whatever? What's your closing statement on your new book?
Well, like you said, I'm delighted that last night I got a call from my publisher, and that's when I learned that the book is now on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's only been out a week. So it's a really amazing response to the book. And I think, I want to empower people. I want to change the political discourse. I would like us to stop debating the wrong things and start debating the right things. I would like everyone to feel comfortable participating in that debate and feeling a sense of ownership in the policy debates that we have, and having the confidence that what they say, the government, what they ask of the government is actually possible, and understand why. And so I hope that it helps people better understand how the economy works and how we could build a better economy. I mean, that's really what it's about.
Well, in that case, we'll leave it there. And again, the book, which I hold in my hand, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of the People's Economy. Stephanie Kelton, thanks so much for coming on the program. It was great to talk to you.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me, Richard.
You bet. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and you're listening to The Zero Hour.